About 45 protesters gathered outside the WGBH studios last week, claiming it was a conflict of interest for the station to keep David Koch on its board of trustees while he contributes to both the science program NOVA and to organizations that undermine global warming.
David H. Koch is a carbon pollution billionaire who's one of the people who's most responsible for the denial of climate change in the United States and the entire world. WGBH should do the right thing and remove David Koch from the board.
Our Beat the Press panel then weighed in on whether the WGBH Foundation did indeed have a conflict of interest, accepting money for a science program from a man who is openly skeptical of climate change. Boston Business Journal editor George Donnelly pointed out that WGBH Board of Trustees Chairman Amos Hofstadter is a leader in climate change policy.
Amos Hofstadter, who's very wealthy from the cable industry, he actually happens to be the Boston area is one of its leading people behind starting climate change initiatives in the city of Boston, the Green Ribbon Commission, for example. And so on the board itself, you have this balance.
That riled the feathers of environmental journalist Peter Dykstra, who tweeted, "Beat the Press uses false balance, incomplete reporting to defend David Koch gifts." So we contacted Dykstra to elaborate.
The world science community has spoken out overwhelmingly that climate change is for real. And rationalizing David Koch's presence on the GBH board by saying, oh, good, there's somebody else there who believes in climate, there's no problem, is the first thing they teach you in journalism school about false balance. He called it balance, I call it false balance.
And says Dykstra, if that misstep wasn't bad enough, we also blew off Koch's influence in the world of climate change deniers.
I couldn't find anything that David Koch said that was a direct denial of climate change.
I'd say that $67 million in funding for climate denial groups is a pretty strong statement. If she couldn't find any quotes from him, that may be because David Koch is virtually a media recluse. He doesn't do interviews. I'd be surprised if you could find many statements from him on anything. But his track record in putting his money where his mouth isn't is that he is a denier of climate change and an enabler of bad science.
Fair enough, but it still leaves open the question, should opinion and belief be reason enough to throw someone off a board of trustees?
Meanwhile, Peter Dykstra made some good points. We could only include some of it. So as a matter of fairness, we're making the whole interview available on our website, beatthepress.org. Well, I thought he made a very strong point about false balance, false equivalency, that just because one guy is a denier doesn't balance off the one. There is no debate over climate change. There is global warming. So that was a good point. I mean, George Donnelly made some other good points on Beat the Press last week. But I still am conflicted over this idea whether your political beliefs or your whatever you believe, religious, whatever it be, is reason enough to not sit on a board. If he were trying to influence NOVA or any of the other programs, then maybe. But I'm conflicted over it, although I see Peter Dykstra's point.
For me, the million-dollar, I'm sorry, Dan, for me, the huge question, and I wasn't part of the discussion last week, is whether he is exercising some sort of a negative influence, getting NOVA or GBH to treat as, you know, not commonly accepted opinion something that is, namely that climate change is real and largely man-made. And you made a pretty compelling case last week. I went back and rewatched the segment that there hasn't been any pernicious editorial effect, that NOVA has treated climate change repeatedly, and I can't remember, it was, you know, 10 or more programs. Yeah. So I understand it's certainly a potential conflict of interest, and I think it's very appropriate for people to point it out. But unless you can show that you know, programming has been squashed that people wanted to conduct because this guy's on the board, or that, you know, topics are being shied away from, that's to me the ultimate question. And it sounds to me like GBH has done pretty well on that count.
That's exactly the point, and I think that's the point that several of us made last week. As long as he is not trying to exercise his influence to affect the programming that WGBH is putting on regarding climate change, I don't think it matters what he thinks. In fact, I think that he has a right to think what he thinks. Peter Dykstra has a right to think what he thinks. Peter Dykstra used to work for Greenpeace before he became a journalist. He has a point of view, and I'm not engaging in false balance because we know that climate change is real. But nevertheless, people come at it with a point of view. I'm sure that WGBH has a lot more liberal donors than it does conservative donors. And do people really want WGBH to boot out a prominent conservative donor and essentially open themselves up to attacks from the right to say, why are you taking money from all these liberal donors? I mean, if people want to donate their time and money and not interfere with the programming, I really don't see what the issue is.
Okay, so the decision for him to be on the board is above my pay grade. I think the reason that Peter Dykstra came at us in several ways, because we didn't spend a lot of time on the other piece, which was at WNET, where he was formerly on the board, David Koch. He was directly involved with having a program stopped. And the way that was handled, we can all debate that. I'm doing the details of it.
I did mention it.
You did mention it, but I'm saying it was put together. So the question was, is it possible that he could be in the same position in this way? Because we know for definitive, for factual, that it was the case at WNET. And there was extenuating circumstances, blah, blah, blah. It was a piece about him. He didn't like it. He said, I'm taking my money out of here. There you go. The way they treated the documentary producers who had a deal, however, that was incorrect. So I need to be clear about that because we didn't spend a lot of time on it. Having said that, so now we have a situation that, that I think Dykstra makes a lot of good points. The one that gave me food for thought was, he said, okay, so let's just go with the guy is funding a show and is, as far as we can say, has no influence on the science, even though he may feel otherwise. And we know that he feels otherwise by what he supports. Would you take money on a piece about politics from the Democratic or Republican Party? Saying, but they won't have any influence on the content, but it's about politics. That's an interesting, I mean, that's a point to ponder. They have, each of those parties have a point of view. Is that okay to say that flies as if they are supporters? And he likens that to the same thing as David Koch being opposed to climate change and yet supporting NOVA. My point I made last week is that the perception of conflict is very real, and we have to address that. And that's what people were protesting as much as his presence on the board.
Perception of conflict is concerning and to be avoided, but there has to be some substance to it. This fellow acknowledges there's no evidence of any conflict. Nothing NOVA or WGBH has done reflects any form of influence. So in other words, really what he's doing is practicing guilt by association. It's like the far-right wingers who claim that because Barack Obama had money raised for him by Bill Ayers, the former weatherman who planted bombs back in the 60s, he consorts with terrorists. It's garbage. I think it's ludicrous. He's free to propound it, but that doesn't make it any less ludicrous without evidence.
All right. I think we're going to be hearing again from Peter Dykstra. All right.